Chapter 1. What is Christian ethics? 1.1. The historical lineage of Christian ethics. Every form of intellectual inquiry has a history. The discipline of Christian ethics is no exception. Here is my brief account of its lineage. Christian ethics obviously begins with Jesus Christ, his person and work, his moral instruction and example. Because Jesus is a historical figure, a first-century Galilean Jew, and because his teaching and way of life reveal the clear impact of his people and his context, the history of Christian ethics also can be said to begin with the texts of the Hebrew Bible, developments in Second Temple Judaism, and the challenging circumstances of first-century Jewish life in an occupied homeland. Because Jewish life in the homeland and in diaspora occurred under the thumb of the Roman Empire and was affected by several centuries of Hellenistic influence, and because the early church spread around the Mediterranean world, Greco-Roman culture and moral philosophy also stand at the headwaters of Christian ethics, with traces that can be seen in the Bible itself. Moving forward into the Christian era, 2 millennia of Christian ethics has followed the contours and reflected the varied influences of Christian ecclesial, theological, and political history. Everything that we know about Christianity's historical trajectory is relevant to understanding the development of Christian ethics. This is one reason why I tell my students that Christian ethics is intrinsically interdisciplinary. You need biblical studies, theology, philosophy, and church history to really understand it. And that is not to mention the relevant disciplines outside Christian thought. In my view, the most important dimension of our historical trajectory is the way Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe. Under Rome, and again a millennium later during the colonial era, Europe became the center of political power for a large part of the world. In these circumstances, Christian ethics was transformed from a prophetic populist Jewish resistance ethic to the moral code of the dominant and dominating European Gentile civilizations. However, something unexpected happened. As Christian conquerors spread their distorted version of the faith along with their colonists and their guns, many of the people whom they conquered, enslaved, and dominated embraced Christianity, but then developed their own versions of theology and ethics. In one of the supreme ironies of history, these dispossessed peoples, mainly indigenous, Latin American, African, and Asian, went back to the headwaters of the Christian faith to creatively retrieve the very Jewish, prophetic, populist resistance ethic that Jesus himself embraced and that imperial churches had obscured or reversed. A geographic metaphor for these fateful developments might look like this. First, there was Athens and Jerusalem as the font of Christian theology and ethics. Many of us were taught this version of Christian intellectual heritage. Now add imperial Christian Rome after the 4th century CE to make up a triad of Jerusalem plus Athens plus Rome. Now go forward 1,000 years and add imperial colonizing Europe. Finally, add the surprising twist of subaltern resistance Christianity. The term subaltern is coined by Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who lived from 1891 to 1937. It essentially refers to peoples colonized and dominated by imperial powers. The term intentionally evokes both the sub, below, and alter, other, dimension of the experience of the colonized. Christian ethics today comes in various versions, reflecting different ways to put together and draw upon this long and complex history. Some versions lean in the direction of Athens and emphasize ancient Greek moral philosophy, with its towering figures of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Others lean in the direction of Jerusalem and mainly work with biblical sources and their multiple trajectories. Some versions move forward a bit to dig deeply into European Christian historical sources, such as the Church Fathers. Others focus on one of the Christian traditions birthed during the long era that gave us Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and various versions of Protestantism. Still others mainly focus on subaltern resistance ethics, with the challenge they offer to every other Christian ethic. A manageable 2-volume set that sketches this history was offered in the early 1990s by Methodist ethicist Philip Wogeman under the titles Christian Ethics, A Historical Introduction and Readings in Christian Ethics. I taught these books for many years and commend them to you for introductory work. Though the field has continued to develop since that time, it is a good place to engage much of our field's history. In this book, you will see me attempt various forays that draw from many of these tributaries of Christian ethics. My account of the field for these last lectures is certainly that, my account. I will do my best to show my work, as when doing mathematics, to indicate where I am turning within the great tradition of Christian ethics to source the arguments that I develop. No two ethicists do this in the same way. 1.2 Ethics as Critical Reflection on Human Morality. One thing that sets Christian ethics apart from Christian theology is that many of the intellectual problems we ethicists think about are shared with all human beings, not just our fellow Christians. While the average human does not wonder about which atonement theory to embrace, most do think about things like whether lying or violence are ever morally right. I am suggesting that there is an intrinsic moral dimension to human experience, and that Christian ethics joins all human beings in reflecting on that dimension of life. Following the approach of my doctoral advisor, Lutheran ethicist Larry Rasmussen, in his 1989 co-authored work, Bible and Ethics in the Christian Life, I am making a rough distinction between ethics and morality. Strictly speaking, ethics is the work of critically investigating morality, assessing it, and making moral recommendations, page 39. Morality, in turn, consists of standards human beings develop and practice concerning their character and behavior toward themselves and others. That's from Kingdom Ethics Glossary, page 465. A way to remember the distinction is this. Ethics is the intellectual effort to critically examine human morality. The terms are not always delineated in this way, but it is helpful to make this distinction. Notice that my definition of morality is descriptive, not normative. I am not saying that humans should develop moral standards. I am describing a fact in the world, one of the most characteristic human behaviors. Humans do develop and articulate moral standards all the time. Just listen when somebody is giving a tongue lashing to or about someone else. You normally hear all kinds of negative moral judgments about the one being criticized. Moral judgments happen when people apply their working moral standards to somebody's behavior, either applauding or condemning actions accordingly. The intrinsic moral dimension of human experience may seem obvious, but it has interesting implications. Among them is that humans are the kind of beings that have the capacity to develop moral standards, and that we inhabit the kind of world in which we need to do so. If we were sub-rational beings or purely creatures of instinct, we would not have the freedom or the capacity to reflect and to emerge with moral standards, technically called moral norms, that is, definitions of what is morally right and wrong. Plants don't do moral reflection, neither do rocks, nor presumably do salmon or salamanders offer moral norms to one another. Ethics does not invent the human propensity to articulate moral norms. Instead, ethics is the second-order work of critically describing, assessing, and proposing alternatives to the moral norms that people have adopted. Ethics steps back from the maelstrom of human morality to offer critical thinking about what exactly is going on here. Some people are not interested in critical reflection about morality. They simply accept what others tell them is right and wrong, good and bad, moral and immoral. But what if those others are wrong? Can you think of any examples of once broadly shared moral norms that we now know were desperately wrong? I hope so. The work of ethics offers a very important example of the necessity of critical thinking in human life. Because many times in history, prevailing standards of, quote, morality have proved to be grotesquely immoral. The term in ethics for the capacity and responsibility of human beings to make moral choices and to be held accountable for them is moral agency. The presupposition of moral agency is moral autonomy, or, quote, moral self-direction, independence, and self-rule. That's from Kingdom Ethics Glossary, page 464. Henceforth, we will say KE Glossary. Moral autonomy and moral agency are central presuppositions of ethics. We must immediately note that not everyone has sufficient moral autonomy to exercise full moral agency. This would include babies, people in a comatose state, and people with severe mental disabilities. We also must not overlook those individuals and groups whose freedom is so unjustly and severely constrained by oppression that their moral agency has been largely taken away from them. The nature of moral agency in the lives of oppressed people has itself become a key theme in ethics that emerges from subaltern communities. The work of morality involves choice-making on the part of at least relatively free and rational human beings. When we choose from among moral options, direct ourselves to act accordingly, and agree to be held responsible, we are exercising moral agency. Think for a moment about the implications of living in the kind of world in which critical reflection on morality is needed. It must be that the proper shape of moral norms is not obvious, self-evident, or agreed. If it were, we would not need to reflect on which moral norms are true, right, or best. This must mean that the world as we find it is at least open to or even requiring of our serious ethical reflection. The world turns out to be morally open rather than closed. It requires hard decisions from us, and it is filled with people who utterly disagree with each other. This could be a counsel of despair. We could stop trying to figure morality out, but to the contrary, most people do develop heartfelt core moral beliefs. In fact, we do not appear to be able to live without them. Let's follow James McClendon and James Smith's 1994 book called Diffusing Religious Relativism and use the term convictions when we're talking about those central beliefs, in our case, moral beliefs, that, quote, cannot be relinquished without making X a significantly different person or community than before. Page 5. Such convictions are life-defining and can be death-defying. They give life meaning and purpose. People will die for them. Sometimes they will also kill for them. Ethics examines that reality, along with other dimensions of the moral arena. 1.3. The Big Questions of Ethics. One way to deepen our reflection on the moral dimension of human experience is to break it down into the most common questions that people tend to ask. I like to describe this as the one big question, capital, and then the 6 not-so-small questions that follow from the one big question. The one big question in the moral arena is, how should I or we live? This can be framed as broadly or as narrowly as one likes. Perhaps on a bleak fall day over a cup or pipe, you might find yourself asking this question in relation to the whole of your life. How should I live my life? Prepare for a long day. Probably, most often, you and I will be asking this question in relation to a specific issue, concern, or relationship. How should I live in relation to money, in relation to politics, in relation to my mother? Ethics examines the answers that people give to the question, how should I or we live? This is the one big question, and it has exercised the minds and hearts of pretty much every human being at one time or another. But it is also possible to break this one big question down into several somewhat smaller questions. All of these are morally significant questions. We rarely ask them all, certainly not all at the same time. Whether we find ourselves inclined to ask one or another of these questions provides important clues to the way our moral sensibilities have developed, either from within us or from how we were raised. They also reflect different strains of moral tradition and the extent to which we are open to critical thinking. So here are the 6 not-so-small questions, with a few lines of comment about each. Most will be developed further in the next chapter. 1.3.1 What are the rules? Human beings very often perceive the existence of moral rules that ought to govern our lives. Or if we do not perceive such rules, we seek them out and try to develop them. And of course, we enter a moral world that already exists and is filled with plenty of rules. We will develop some detailed vocabulary around moral rules in the next chapter, but for now, let us just begin by saying that one way to ask the one big question, how should I live, is to break it down to the smaller question, what are the rules that should govern how I live? The comforting thing about this question is that rules are often clear, direct, and unambiguous. They tell us directly what to do or refrain from doing. Moral uncertainty is troubling and in some cases agonizing. Having rules to tell us exactly how we should live removes a great deal of uncertainty. There is a reason why clear, unambiguous moral rules, sometimes called moral laws or divine commandments, tend to be generated plentifully by religious traditions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But of course, rules also introduce their own problems, such as, what if we cannot agree on what the rules are? What if important moral rules conflict with each other? What if no one has ever made up a moral rule about this situation before? 1.3.2 What are the goals? These perhaps surprising complexities related to moral rules have helped lead many ethicists to argue that the better question in the moral life is about moral goals. What purposes should I or we seek to achieve in life overall, or in relation to this or that morally significant area of life? Once we determine morally worthy goals to pursue, then the right course of action is that which most clearly advances progress toward those goals. Some aspects of the moral life seem better addressed by this goals question than by the rules question. Let's say a core goal of your life is to be a loving partner. This sets you on a daily path of trying to discern what being a loving partner requires of you. It's not about adhering to rules, but instead aiming yourself toward this morally substantial goal. Rules alone do not a romance make, that is for sure. One can easily make the case, as many have, including the ancient Greek philosophers, that rules are subordinate to goals. Take an example from education. For educators, our fundamental goal is to offer quality education to students. Every academic course lists some learning objectives that aim to fulfill this broader goal. The rules that are also listed on a course syllabus exist as means to the end of offering quality education. When rule thinking gets out of hand, as it sometimes does, even in academia, people can forget the reasons why the rules were there in the first place. But goal thinkers can sometimes play fast and loose with the rules that provide order and fairness to most human endeavors. 1.3.3 What serves the needs of people and relationships? This third question, which came into focus through the efforts of modern feminist thinkers, beginning with Carol Gilligan's 1982 book, In a Different Voice, decenters rules and goals and centers the, quote, ethics of care for people and relationships. The question is, what course of action cares best for others and strengthens the relevant relationships involved? The keen insight embedded in this question is this: morality is a social concern. Moral questions and challenges arise in relationships. The more important the relationship is to us, the more urgent will be our sense that we need to act in such a way as to care for the people we love and to protect the relationships that we most value. As I begin this book, I have entered a stage in life in which I have substantial responsibilities of care for my 90-year-old father, who lives in an independent living community and whose health is fragile. When I wake up each day, one of the questions never far from my mind is this: what do I need to do today to take care of my father? And this: what actions do I need to take that will demonstrate how much I value him and our relationship? This is a reminder that the most important moral questions are relational questions. Morality arises in relational contexts. Whatever rules we establish or goals that we set had best help us to care well for others and preserve or enhance important relationships. It is quite striking that this relational and care focus was not central in ethics until modern feminism. This says something rather disturbing about the way many men think and about the blind spots of a discipline dominated by men until the late 20th century. One challenge with this third question is determining how or even whether to rank order our relationships, such that some receive, for a while or always, greater and more solicitous care, while others receive less. Another concern is whether in attempting to care for people and relationships, we might bend or even break important moral rules. 1.3.4 What kind of people should we be? There is a way of looking at morality that focuses not so much on what we do or on what the rules are, but on who we are. The term for this is moral character, the qualities that mark or distinguish an individual or a people over time, moral constitution, temperament, and distinctive virtues and vices. That's a quote from K.E. Glossary, page 451. One of the great contributions of ancient Greek ethics is the claim that human actions flow from human character, which is where moral effort should therefore focus. This begins us on the trail toward virtue ethics, quote, theories or traditions that emphasize the formation of character and the development of virtue as central to the moral life. K.E. Glossary, page 474. Chapter 7 will focus on this subject. The wisdom of the virtue ethics tradition is immense. Retrieved for Protestant Ethics by Stanley Hauerwas in books such as his 1981 A Community of Character, and never absent from Catholic and Orthodox ethics, virtue ethics understands that people are not just moment-by-moment decision-makers, but instead have been formed over time and have developed habits, patterns, and characteristics that surface in many different decision-making contexts. Ethicists can write as many moral action guides describing fitting, right, or good courses of action as we might like. That's from K.E. Glossary, page 449. But people will most often do what is in them to do. Their actions will reflect their character. Character ethics has the salutary benefit of focusing not just on decisions or dilemmas, but people as they really are, as beings developing over time, with a moral momentum shaped by a range of complex factors. But character ethics can be critiqued for sometimes abandoning the effort to offer moral rules or goals in relation to various challenging areas of life, and for overemphasizing the potency of virtuous character to generate good decisions. 1.3.5 What kind of community should we seek to develop? The fifth, not so small question turns the focus away from the moral self to the moral community. How do we develop communities of people that are morally sound, good, and just? This is sometimes called communitarian ethics, and it also has seen a revival in recent decades through the work of such philosophers as Alasdair MacIntyre, beginning with his influential 1981 book, After Virtue. This question focuses on the fact that the development of morality is a social task, aimed at the moral well-being of various communities, and not just an individual concern. I'm speaking of every kind of social grouping: families, neighborhoods, villages, congregations, schools, political parties, workplaces, civic associations, and nations. Social entities of every type find it necessary to develop moral standards. This might seem strange to us at first, but that's only because many of us have been immersed in a deep cultural individualism that obscures from our view collective moral projects. But think about it. Most parents at least attempt to teach morality to their children. All schools offer rules, while many offer core moral goals or values. Workplaces give employees thick manuals with the company's vision, values, and rules. Societies communicate some vision of core communal or national values and rules. Those most mistreated in various communities constantly challenge the functioning morality of those groups. Indeed, from the subaltern perspective, the ultimate question of community morality almost always amounts to something more focused like this: what must we do to demand that this community stop doing injustice to us? What steps of liberation might we undertake to create a just community? When understood in this key, communitarian ethics becomes liberation ethics, which emerges from below, not from within a community's power structures. It happens when the main question being asked of the community is when exactly everyone will finally get to be free. Various expressions of liberation ethics and theology will be noted multiple times in this book. 1.3.6 What behavior is responsible and responsive before neighbor and God? Perhaps you've been surprised not to meet the language of moral responsibility until now. For many people, perhaps more in the past than today, the idea that morality involves acting responsibly is central. I want to use this part of the definition of moral responsibility that is in my book, Kingdom Ethics. Quote, it's on page 466. Human beings should act not on the basis of abstract rules, but instead by considering the most responsible course of action, that is, the best response to God and people in a given situation. What is most interesting about this sixth, not-so-small question is the idea that morality is about responsiveness, responsibility, about developing the ability and willingness to respond to dilemmas, people, and situations in the best possible manner. This type of moral thinking, sometimes called responsibility ethics or response ethics, developed by the ethicist H. Richard Niebuhr in his 1963 book, The Responsible Self, heightens attention to the specific situations in which moral choices arise. The moral question in real life is usually about what kind of response fits best, is most fitting in this exact moment relating to this person under these conditions. If we are religious people, we might also believe that moral challenges come to us not just from people and situations, but from God. We might believe that our obligation is to find the path that is responsive not just to people, but to God. If that is how we look at the world, morality takes on a religious dimension. That leads us to the next and final section of this chapter. 1.4 Christian Ethics again. At last we reach the place in our discussion where we are ready to modify the term ethics with the word Christian and continue forward from there. Let me make a few bold assertions that should bear themselves out during this study. Like a Venn diagram, Christian ethics both overlaps with general human ethics and is distinct from it. We are fellow human beings with others, and we share with others the intrinsic moral dimension of human experience and the need to think critically about morality. We are not exempt from any of the complexity of establishing moral standards or the difficulty of living up to the standards that we establish. Despite sometimes overly exalted claims about Christian virtue, we share the human condition and the challenges of the human moral task. We can learn much from the efforts of ethicists, other communities, and everyday people as they do the work of ethics. We need to humbly join others in what my late Baptist colleague Stan Grenz, who lived from 1950 to 2005, called The Moral Quest, a book published first in 2000. Yet Christians do belong to a faith community to which not everyone belongs. Our committed participation in Christian community can and ought to shape our morality in profound ways. One of these ways is that we are heirs to the Christian moral tradition that I described at the outset of this chapter. Even though there is plenty of what British theologian ethicist Samuel Wells memorably described in 2004 as improvisation in Christian ethics, like actors, our improv is rooted in a tradition that both sets limits and opens the door to an appropriate originality. While one can speak of a broad, shared Christian moral tradition, its content is debated. What matters for most everyday Christians are the distinctive moral traditions developed within Christianity's major branches, or the thematic distinctives to which we have been exposed or have committed ourselves. We are Baptist or Catholic or Orthodox, liberationist or communitarian or virtue ethicists. And yet, all are expressions of the shared Christian tradition, all tributaries of a river that never stops flowing. Christian ethics is ultimately the effort to know and do God's will as we have met God in Jesus Christ. This means that Christian ethics is ultimately a form of religious and even theological ethics, by contrast with ethics based purely on reason or experience. Traditionally, at least, Christian ethics joins revelation-based religions such as Judaism and Islam in claiming a divine source for at least the most important human moral obligations. Christian ethics draws on sources of authority that to a large extent are internal to the Christian community, which is another distinctive feature. These include the Bible, Christian tradition, church leaders and theologians, and even the spiritual dimensions and powers of Christian formation and practice. We will return to this theme in Chapter 3. The complexity of Scripture alone provides a sufficient clue as to the challenge of handling the sources that shape Christian ethics. The necessity and the difficulty of reading Scripture for ethics will be a constant theme in this book. Many who read this book will be seminary students. Christian ethics is the work of seminarians in part because of your calling to serve Christ's church in some fashion. As Sandra Wheeler argues in her 2017 book, The Minister as Moral Theologian, which we will consider in detail later, Christian ministers bear unique responsibilities within Christian communities to guide God's people to good, right, and fitting moral thinking and action. All Christians are called to be moral. Christian clergy, however, are called not only to be moral, but to be moral theologians, that is, ethicists, to reflect on and shape the morality of Christian communities. It is a high calling indeed. We are now prepared to dig deeper into the structure of moral theory, a subject in philosophical ethics with relevance in religious and Christian ethics. This will be our next topic. Discussion questions. 1. To what extent do you believe that general human morality and then Christian morality will or should end up looking similar? 2. Review the distinction between the terms ethics and morality in this chapter. 3. Can you think of any human beings you know who could not really be described as having moral agency, as defined in this discussion? 4. Which of the 6 not-so-small questions of ethics was the most unfamiliar or surprising to you? Which of those questions sounded most familiar to your own approach or background? 5. Can you name a moral conviction that, if you relinquished it, would redefine your identity?